And I'm Harry Murray, and I'm from Rochester, New York, and kind of started with the Catholic Worker in the late 1970s at a place called Unity Kitchen in Syracuse. Um, Went on to get a PhD in sociology and did my dissertation on hospitality in the Catholic Worker. Um, And since about 1986, I've been living in Rochester. I uh, recently retired from Nazareth College and have been associated with St. Joseph's House of Hospitality here in Rochester, running the Saturday meal for about 35 years. Um, and St. Joe's, I always like to say, is the oldest Catholic worker house in the known universe. Um, in terms of the building, we've been in the same building since 1941. And I think it might be the only Catholic worker building left that Peter Morin actually was in. Anyway, as has everybody heard of Nikolai Berdyaev, or at least heard the name a little bit? Okay, good. I won't have to say too much about why to talk about him. I first learned of Berdyaev in the 1970s through the writings of Peter Morin, um, but actually I was able to find copies of a couple of his books in a bookstore in Ithaca while I was getting a master's in city planning at Cornell. And while learning all about planning, I found Berdyev's rather anarchist approach rather intriguing, um, a good alternative to to I was what I was picking up at Cornell. Um, I also really like his writing style in many ways, not really systematic, but he had a lot of great sayings, a lot of great aphorisms. So I'll be quoting a lot of those as we go along, if that's okay. Um, so just to, I'm going to talk a little bit about his life and then talk about the two books of his that Peter Morin referred to numerous times, and and then talk about some of his more general ideas from focusing on a couple of his other major books. And feel free to interrupt with questions or comments. I know Spencer uh, also knows quite a bit about Berdyaev, maybe more than I do. So just join in at any time. Um, so anyway, Nikolai Berdyaev was born in 1874 on an estate near Kiev, uh, into a noble family which had French roots. One of his ancestors had been the French ambassador to Constantinople uh, before the French Revolution, and after the revolution fled to Russia, where he was given asylum um, by Catherine the Great. Uh, Nikolai's father was apparently not a great money manager, had to sell their estate and bought a house in Kiev. At age 10, Nikolai was sent to a military school, um, which produced a lifelong antipathy to war and to the military as an institution. He entered university in 1894, became involved in underground political activity associating with Marxists. Um, he was arrested at a demonstration in 1897, but was soon released, although he never completed an academic degree. He was arrested a second time for his role in an underground newspaper, served 6 weeks in prison, and then was exiled to Vologda in 1900. Um, it was apparently a pretty lenient kind of exile. His first biographer says that he rented a room in the most luxurious hotel in town. so he wasn't imprisoned or anything. Um, in 1904, he returned to Kiev, where he married Lydia Trushev and then moved to St. Petersburg. It was during this period that he actually uh, went away from Marxism and embraced Christianity. In 1908, he moved to Moscow. There he was arrested again, charged with blasphemy against the Orthodox Church um, because he had criticized its use of military force against a group of monks. Um, he would have been exiled to Siberia, but the case was dragged out until the revolution, so that didn't occur. Um, he spoke out publicly against the revolution, but rather surprisingly was allowed to go on um, writing and even giving public lectures for 5 years. But in 1921, he was arrested and held in solitary confinement for 6 weeks, released after a personal interview by the head of the Cheka. He was rearrested in 1922 and banished. He went first to Berlin with a group of exiles where he met the early personalist Max Scheler. In 1925, he moved to Paris, where he soon became friends with Jacques Maritain and joined in the intellectual life of Emmanuel Mounier's group of personalists. He also became involved in a progressive Orthodox church led by Mother Maria Skobstova, who would die in the gas chamber at Ravensbrück in 1945 for sheltering Jews. Um, uh, During the Second World War and the occupation, he wrote anti-Nazi material but was not arrested, and he died in his study in 1948. One of the things that always impressed me was that he was arrested and imprisoned by both the Tsarist government and the communists. So I figure anybody that could anger both of them had to have something important to say. Okay. Peter Morin, as far as I know, only cited two books by Berdyaev, and so I'll kind of start with those the ones that attracted Peter. Although a number of Berdyaev's books were published after Peter's illness and death, so he would have not had the chance to see them. Christianity and Class War was published in English in 1933. It had been published in Russian 2 years earlier. Um, and The Bourgeois Mind was published in 1934. Um, Morin first included Christianity and Class War in his recommended book lists in the December 15th, 1933 issue of the Catholic Worker. So that was a hit with him really early on. The Bourgeois Mind was mentioned first in the January 1935 issue. Um, there's considerable overlap between the two books, so I'll kind of talk about them together and just kind of merge it. Both works critique both Marxism and capitalism. They critique Karl Marx by rejecting his materialism, yet they adapt some of his basic concepts to incorporate a more spiritual perspective. Berdyaev dedicated Christianity and Class War to Marx, quote, who was the social master of my youth and whose opponent in ideas I have now become. Berdyaev appropriates but drastically revises Marx's notion of the bourgeoisie or middle class. For Marx, the bourgeoisie is a social class composed of property owners and employers, which came to power in the wake of feudalism. He distinguished between the bourgeoisie proper, who both own productive property like factories and have employees, and what he called the petty bourgeois, who owned productive property, such as a small workshop, but had no employees. Um, Marx argued that the bourgeoisie created the proletariat, the working class, which were destined to overthrow the capitalist order of the bourgeoisie. He asserted that the bourgeoisie had a culture, a view of life, a way of thinking, perhaps even what Berdyaev would call a spirit, However, Marx's dialectical materialist approach asserted that this spirit was a product of its class position. Um, the material conditions of life, the economic conditions, are what Marx called the substructure on which things like ideas, spirit, religion, education, government, and the family are based. For Marx, these latter things are merely the superstructure of society, which can be entirely explained by the socioeconomic substructure. For Berdyaev, in contrast, the bourgeois is a spirit, not a social class. He states, bourgeois designates a spiritual state. It is neither a social nor an economic condition, yet it is something more than a psychological and ethical one. It is spiritual. In the very depths of his being or non-being, the bourgeois is distinguishable from the not bourgeois. The state of being bourgeois has always existed in the world. Middle classness is not determined by a person's economic situation, but by his spiritual attitudes towards this position. Wherein are to be found the spiritual roots of this malady? In too strong a faith in this visible world and unbelief in another invisible world. So for Berdyaev, bourgeois existence is essentially materialist existence. Middle classdom is enslavement of the spirit, its crushing by the external hard world, dependence upon the temporary and corruptible, incapacity for breaking through to eternity. The bourgeois is oppressed by the tangible. The bourgeois spirit is an eternal principle, one of the world principles which manifest themselves ever under new forms. The bourgeois spirit has been around since ancient times. It was in Babylon that appeared the first middle-class civilization recorded by history. Its spirit was vigorously denounced by Ezekiel. Her princes in the midst thereof are like the wolves ravening the prey, to shed blood and to destroy souls, to get dishonest gain. The people of the land have used oppression and exercised robbery and have vexed the poor and the needy. Berdyaev continues, to the vision of the ancient prophets were revealed the catastrophes which would inevitably follow upon the triumph of the bourgeois spirit. When Jesus criticized the scribes and Pharisees, according to Berdyaev, he was criticizing precisely the bourgeois spirit. However, it was only in early modern Europe that the bourgeois spirit became socially dominant. Here, in terms of chronology, Berdyaev basically agrees with Marx. Berdyaev says, but antiquity knew only a tendency towards the bourgeois spirit. It never saw its final triumph. It was left to our European culture to accomplish its victory and to give the world's destinies into the hands of the bourgeois. When the bourgeois spirit becomes dominant in society, it leads to a decline in spirituality. It is no longer kept in bounds by the sacred symbolism of a nobler traditional culture. The bourgeois spirit emancipated itself, expanded, and it was at last, able to express its own type of life. The will to power, to well-being, to wealth triumphs over the will to holiness. The highest spiritual achievements belong to the past. Spirituality is on the wane, and a time of spiritual decline is a time of bourgeois ascendancy. Berdyaev argued that it was not only the rich who could be captured by the bourgeois spirit. He says, the rich man, spiritually enslaved by his wealth and enslaving others, is a prisoner of the world, and it is more difficult for him to enter the kingdom than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. But the poor man, envying the rich and spiritually enslaved by the desire of usurping his place and his wealth, is the same bourgeois, and his entry into the kingdom is in no wise easier. Now, much of Berdyaev's critique of the bourgeois spirit came not from Marx, but from Leon Bloy's book, Exegesis of Commonplaces, which was a critique of French bourgeois sayings like the equivalent of A penny saved is a penny earned, and be practical. It was published in France in 1902 and is cited in both of Berdyaev's book. It actually bears some resemblance to Max Weber's discussion of the maxims of Benjamin Franklin in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which was published just a year after Bloy's book. In his autobiography, Berdyaev notes that he became familiar with Bloy's writings while he was still in Russia, and that it was actually Bloy's widow who introduced Berdyaev to Jacques Maritain shortly after he arrived in Paris. So it might have been the Bloy connection that kind of led him into the personalist circles. Berdyaev's treatment of the bourgeois spirit is also in many ways reminiscent of Max Weber's notion of the spirit of capitalism. Weber argues that the spirit of capitalism is the drive to maximize your earnings and wealth, spending as little as possible so that you die as wealthy as possible. For Weber, this was derived from the Calvinist ethic, or what he called the Protestant ethic, which advocated that same maximization of wealth as a means of assuring yourself that you are saved in the face of the terrors of predestination, because the Calvinists asserted that God rewards the saved with worldly wealth. Over time, however, according to Weber, the religious motive was lost and maximizing wealth became an end in itself. So for Berdyaev, Bloy, and Weber, the spirit of capitalism is essentially godless. Despite this, a bourgeois, according to Berdyaev, may belong to a religion, but even if so, his or her true allegiance is to the material world. Again, a number of quotes from him. The bourgeois, even when he is a good Catholic, believes only in this world, in the expedient and the useful. The bourgeois is an idolater, enslaved by the visible. Business is the bourgeois's God, his absolute. It was the bourgeois who crucified Christ. A bourgeois may be religious, and this middle-class religiosity is more hateful in Bloy's eyes than atheism. The bourgeois has never acknowledged any saint during his lifetime, but only long after canonization and universal acceptance. He is bereft of any spiritual fire, of any spiritual creativeness. Contemplation, which could free him, is unknown to him. And the bourgeois spirit is nothing but the rejection of Christ. Even those whose lips confess him may be the first to crucify him anew. He probably basically stole that from Dostoevsky's legend of the Grand Inquisitor, which he refers to time and time again. Okay. Berdyaev argues that even communist revolutionaries are in their heart bourgeois because they don't acknowledge the spiritual. The bourgeois may be an extreme conservative or an extreme revolutionary, but in both cases, he is chained to the visible world and knows no spiritual freedom. The Russian communist has expressed this type of bourgeois culture, a type sinister in its godlessness. In him, the middle-class spirit has shown itself in a purer, stronger, unlimited form. Now, although Berdyaev was critical of Marx's materialism, he decisively parts company with capitalist critiques of Marxism, those who portray class war as a Marxist invention, which is only carried out by communist revolutionaries and the working class. Berdyaev says, the current notion that the class war was invented by Marx and the socialists, and that it is carried on solely by the revolutionary workers, is dishonest and wrong. It is actually carried on just as much by the middle and the governing classes. The maintenance of the status quo is not looked upon as an arbitrary act of war, but to try to alter it is. That is one of our contemporary fallacies. Inasmuch as the workers and socialists wage their class war openly, declaring publicly that they are fighting for the proletarian cause, they are superior to the bourgeois who are doing the same thing, but under the cover of lofty sentiments. They appeal to patriotism, the safety of the state, liberty, the principles of civilization, and, most unhappily, to religion. Berdyev's major criticism of Marx is that his reliance on materialism prevents him from fully appreciating the spiritual nature of the human person. Marx rails against capitalism because it turns the person into a thing, a commodity even, but because of his personalism, Marx cannot fully grasp the significance of turning the person into a thing. Berdyaev, here we reach Marx's biggest contradiction. He demonstrates that capitalism turns relation of men into relations of things. That it is his most notable discovery and an authentic truth, but it signifies that beyond the economic and material world, Marxism perceived living men and creative beings. Marxism is a revolt against capitalism, but it has been bred by it and carries the fatal mark of its materialist spirit. It is the Christian conception of the world and not the materialist, which is in opposition to this transformation of men into things. He argues that a society dominated by the bourgeois spirit of materialism cannot endure. Our civilization cannot endure. The bourgeois is destructive of eternity. Capitalism has only substituted a new and disguised form of servile work for the one that existed before. The working man, that is to say, the man without means of production, who can only live by selling his neighbor, is constrained by nobody. He enjoys identical political rights with the capitalist. He takes part in parliamentary elections. But in reality, his liberty is simply the freedom to die of hunger if he prefers that alternative to the painful and degrading work of a factory. Freedom of work means the freedom to sell one's work as though it were merchandise, and this freedom must be exercised under a threat of starvation. The buyer is in a position to wait and choose, the seller is not. Here he's practically echoing the words of Marx. And also, a regime which allows revolting indigence in spite of a general increase of wealth, which is obliged in the name of economic interest to destroy superfluous goods, although there are people in need of them, which breeds abominable wars, which is possessed by a greed for riches, which has become transformed into a disinterested passion. Such a regime is completely mad and stands condemned by conscience and by reason. Finally, capitalism has got to go entirely. Berdyaev affirms the primacy of the spiritual over the material. Only a spiritual solution can address the problem of the bourgeois. Neither economics nor class war is the supreme might. That can be found only in the spirit. Matter is weak, inert, passive. Spirit is active. It moves the very materialists who refuse to recognize it. Spirit alone can defeat the bourgeois condition. No material means will avail. Okay, thus the church and Christians must take a stand on the side of the working class. Though we as Christians part company with Marx in his estimate of value, it is most certainly not in order that we may side with and support the cause of capitalism and the bourgeoisie. All class mentality smothers the spiritual man and paralyzes the Christian conscience. We may violently repudiate the bourgeois spirit and principles. We may fight against a social system, but we may not hate the bourgeois as a human being. It is the church's duty to condemn the oppression and exploitation of man by man, primarily on moral and spiritual grounds, and not in the name of some social system. Christians ought to be on the side of work and the workers. Racialism, whatever its cause, is a preeminently anti-Christian phenomenon. And there, I think he was referring to the rise of Nazism and their ideology. Crucially here, he invokes the spirit of Gandhian nonviolence as the means for the struggle. He says, Gandhi is not a Christian, but his passive resistance, his inoffensive war, are far more in accordance with the spirit of Christianity than are the methods to which so-called Christian societies so often have recourse. This is the only time I know of, and Spencer or someone else might know differently, that Berdyaev actually refers specifically to Gandhi, although uh, in his posthumously published book, Truth and Revelation, he states that in its ultimate depth, truth is God and God is truth. And I suspect there that he is quoting Gandhi's famous statement that truth is God. Um, can't establish that for sure, but that's what I know. Anyway, that's sort of my summary of the bourgeois mind and Christianity and class war. I've been babbling on quite a bit. Before I get into some broader topics, does anybody have any questions or thoughts about what I've been saying so far, or what Berdyaev has been saying, more importantly?